Hello, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to this special edition of LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multi-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of the culture. We're grateful to our co-hosts this evening, the Center for American Studies at Columbia University and the Center for Women's History at the New York Historical Society, which explores the lives and legacies of women who have shaped and continue to shape the American experience. We're grateful for additional promotional support from Daughter Press, the National Women's History Museum, Veteran Feminists of America, Women's March, and the Women's Review of Books. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. This event marks publication of Women's Liberation, Feminist Writings That Inspired a Revolution and Still Can, a new Library of America collection edited with insight and passion by Alix Schulman and Honor Moore, who join us tonight. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the writers gathered here helped create a diverse, visionary, and revolutionary movement for freedom and social justice that matters as much now as it ever has. Alix and Honor's book works on several levels. It rediscovers forgotten history and voices, dispelling in the process myths and half-truths about the movement. It pays homage to the vision and audacity and power of a courageous group of writers, and it passes the torch from one path-breaking generation of remarkable women to those who've come after. Women's Liberation is published with support from Brooke Adams and Tony Shalhoub, Ellen Chesler, Annette Cumming, Bobby Falk, Nancy Rubin, and Jennifer Soros. Thanks to their generosity, this volume stands as an indispensable tribute, resource, inspiration, and provocation. Tonight, a distinguished panel considers the living questions at the heart of this book. What is this tradition, and what is its legacy? What unfulfilled possibilities does it hold for today? Our moderator is Honor Moore, co-editor with Alix Schulman of Women's Liberation, and author most recently of Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Midcentury. For Library of America, Honor has also edited Poems from the Women's Movement. Before turning things over to her, here to introduce the evening is Alix Schulman, whose groundbreaking, best-selling novel, Memoirs of an Ex-Prom Queen, has just been reissued. The panelists invite your questions and comments. You can submit one at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. And when you do, please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome Alix Schulman.
Thank you, Max. Our book begins with the awakening of a new feminist consciousness in America in the 1960s. It proceeds through the creative ferment and explosive spread in the 1970s and 80s of both a diverse, multiracial mass women's liberation movement and a powerful, radical, sometimes revolutionary literature. It concludes with the devastating backlash that gained momentum during the 1980s and brought the movement nearly to a standstill. Among the 90 works in this volume, running from 1963 to 1991, early entries include mimeographed broadsides, rousing manifestos, and provocative essays from the new underground women's liberation newspapers and journals springing up all around the country. Then, from the feminist publishing boom of the 1970s and 80s, we excerpted many impassioned books that invented new topics or overhauled old ones. Because women's liberation literature is so vast, we include only nonfiction, leaving aside the abundance of poetry, fiction, drama, and scholarly literature the movement inspired. Reading this volume from the beginning, you get a sense of the grand sweep of 3 decades of women's liberation history and, contrary to common misconceptions, of the movement's range of race, class, ethnicity, sexuality, ideology, style, and so much more. The powerful new ideas of feminism emerged before your eyes, including some ideas that are now widely taken for granted. And with movement activists marching, lobbying, and demanding, many women gained new rights and opportunities once unimaginable. That is many, but not all women, not all of those ideas, and not the full range of experience. Several of the most trenchant essays in our anthology address the disparate rights and opportunities available in practice depending on race, class, ethnicity, sexuality. For Honor and me, working together every Friday for 5 years, except summers, it was immensely gratifying to experience again the literature that shook us up and changed our lives. For all of us living in this moment of heightened activism, but especially for those who did not experience the women's liberation movement, we hope you may discover in these writings, as we wrote in our introduction, paths imagined but not taken, cautionary reflections, insightful analyses, creative actions, damaging mistakes, and most of all, inspiration. Now Honor will introduce the panel.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Alix, for that beautiful introduction. And can't believe we finally finished this book. And thank you, Max and the Library of America and all our sponsors and co-sponsors. It feels like a celebration of a real communal effort. There's a quote I just want to start with from our introduction. And at the center of everything that the women's liberation achieved was the writing that both forged and propelled it, writing that continues to inspire, challenge, educate, and even offend. I love that part. So welcome again. And our panelists, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Margo Jefferson is a Pulitzer Prize winning critic, a memoirist, and author of Negroland, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award, and On Michael Jackson. She teaches in Columbia University's writing program. Barbara Smith is a Black feminist author and activist who has worked in movements for social justice since the 1960s. She is a co-founder of the Combahee River Collective and Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. In 2005, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Jennifer Baumgardner is author of Manifesta, Grassroots, and Look Both Ways, Bisexual Politics, and director-producer of the documentaries I Had an Abortion and It Was Rape. In 2017, she became editor of Women's Review of Books and launched Daughter Press. All of us had a moment when we discovered women's liberation. I remember I was with a bunch of drama school dropouts. I was in drama school. I had dropped out because of sexism, which I didn't know that was why I dropped out. But we were sitting around smoking cigarettes after a performance outdoors, and a woman turned to me and she said, "Have you heard?" The only other woman in the group, "Have you heard they're doing this thing in New York called women's liberation?" And it was like, and I determined to move to New York. Margo, I thought maybe you could introduce this segment reading a little something from the book.
I will, and I will also talk a bit about the moments of discovering feminism. I'm going to read a bit from Alice Walker's 1974 essay, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. How was the creativity of the Black woman kept alive year after year and century after century when for most of the years Black people had been in America, it was a punishable crime for a Black person to read or write? And the freedom to paint, to sculpt, to expand the mind with action did not exist. Consider, if you can bear to imagine it, what might have been the results if singing too had been forbidden by law. Listen to the voices of Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, and Aretha Franklin, among others, and imagine those voices muzzled for life. Then you may begin to comprehend the lives of our crazy, sainted mothers and grandmothers. The agony of the lives of women who might have been poets, novelists, essayists, and short story writers over a period of centuries, who died with their real gifts stifled within them. But that is not the end of the story. For all the young women, our mothers and grandmothers, ourselves, those who come after us, have not perished in the wilderness. And if we ask ourselves why and search for and find the answer, we will know beyond all efforts to erase it from our minds just exactly who and of what we Black American women are. This was 1974. I first encountered feminism as a secretary at Planned Parenthood who was planning higher destiny at least with graduate school. A friend, also a secretary at Planned Parenthood, brought me notes from the second year, and I was galvanized by every essay in it, especially the radical rigor of T. Grace Atkinson and Shulman Firestone. That same year, I read Frances Beale's pamphlet, Double Jeopardy to be Black and Female, one of the first intersectionality writings. And again, so blazingly radical. Then 1970 came that first anthology that led the way to visible Black feminism, The Black Woman, which had Audre Lorde, writings about those civil rights women leaders who had been pretty much erased from formal official histories of civil rights. And from then on, there was every direction to go in. Radical political writing, experimental writing. You could go from Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto to Pauli Murray's memoir, Proud Shoes, into Saki Shange, Gloria Anzaldúa. There was everything. And there were demonstrations. there was hard work as well as ecstasy. And really, it was ecstatic.
Jennifer, I'm thinking of what you said the other day when we were talking. You said Jennifer is from what my mother would have called the younger set, the younger generation whose mother had Ms. on the coffee table. And was that your sort of introduction to feminism?
Yeah, I was born in 1970. I was raised in Fargo, North Dakota. And feminism came into my mom's life when she already had 3 kids, was married, stay-at-home mom. But it affected her. I remember suddenly she said, I'm a homemaker, not a housewife. And there was just a lot of asserting of herself in ways that I think had a really good, positive influence on me.
Yeah.
She was clear about the ways in which she found some of her life, tedious and not well compensated in any way. And there were 3 daughters, and we were raised to think about feminism as a tool that could help us. Mm-hmm. And I really think it did. And then when I left Fargo and went to college, it was sort of the beginning, at least at my school in Wisconsin, of gender studies. It was the first year, and so I took some gender studies courses. And Ms. Magazine was reissued as a ad-free MAGA book, they called it, when I was about a junior or senior. It was also the same time as the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings. And I just became really electrified with the possibilities of feminism to make sense of my life. And I moved to New York City when I was 22. I got an internship at Ms. Magazine, and I met so many of the people in this book. And I'm so grateful for that. It still kind of wows me that you can move to New York and just sort of look people up in the phone book and ask them to tea. And they're like, okay. And that's how I met Alix Kate Schulman, actually. But so many people, Shalom with Firestone, Kate Millett, Robin Morgan, she was the editor-in-chief at the time, then Marcia Gillespie, Ellen Willis. It just sort of went on.
That's an amazing story. Barbara, one of the things that's distinctive about you're one of the contributors of the book, in the book. And so I have learned about you because I had to write about you in a headnote. And I was very interested in the interplay between organizing and writing in your life as a feminist. I'm curious how you came to feminism and the confluence of those two dynamics. You're muted.
Yes, I thought that was going to happen magically. Someone's going to do it for me. Anyway, I'm just so happy to be a part of this really great discussion. When I first heard about the women's movement, it was 1969. I was actually 68, fall of 68, and I was in my senior year of college, and I met someone under fascinating circumstances. She was traveling with Mark Rudd, who was the visible and known leader of the strike at Columbia that had happened the school year before. And in any event, she was described and self-described as being a part of women's liberation. And I could not wrap my mind around it. I just could not understand, what did white women have to be complaining about? Because I knew what Black women were up against, and also how mistreated we had often been in the context, particularly of domestic work. We were second-class citizens. All Black people were at that time, and it just didn't make any sense to me that the person, or the persons, plural, on the pedestal were unhappy about something. When I graduated from college and went to graduate school immediately to study English, as it was called at that time, I quickly found out about how sexism was affecting my own life. I actually went to a women's college. I went to Mount Holyoke, and so I didn't have that kind of experience in college of like being, an afterthought. But as I said, it didn't take me very long, and there were people in my graduate program who were beginning to build women's studies, and sometimes I would meet with them. But it was really when the National Black Feminist Organization started, and Margaret Sloan, one of the co-founders of the National Black Feminist Organization, she's included in this wonderful book. It was when it became clear that I could be both a woman and Black simultaneously and be committed to feminism. That's how I got involved. And it's been a juggling act about writing and activism ever since. So I don't have any great answers for that. But
don't? Why not?
Well, I always hope that my writing is toward actual material change in the world, not just pretty pictures.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I wonder, one of the things that came out of a lot of these actions, I'm thinking that part of what came out of your sort of combination of activism and English graduate studies was Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. And I'm thinking of in Boston, where you're from, a consciousness raising group of a bunch of women in health care gave birth to the Boston Women's Health Collective and Our Bodies Ourselves, which revolutionized medicine. I mean, it not only
Absolutely
revolutionized medicine for women, but it sort of changed it initiated this whole movement for patient rights. I'm curious about those institutions. Margo, I know that you and Michelle Wallace and Faith Ringgold had a kind of women's performance group.
Well, Michelle and I were at the not very supportive Feminists or Blacks institution of Newsweek magazine together. And she was beginning in the 70s to write for The Voice and write what would become her Black feminist book. Michelle and I, Michelle and Faith were both part of NBFO, which I was, which so many of us were. So, you know, there were so many readings and performances going on in those days. And, you know, again, we wanted the historical lineage of Black women's voices, from, you know, ministers to radicals, to poets and artists. So that's why we put together that particular performance. But New York was full of that, in the same way that it was full of you know, small and dynamic publishing companies. You know,
Yes.
you would get new work, you would get reissues, you know, from books that had not been seen in 50 or 60 years. There were women's bookstores. You could go
Yes,
to.
and the women's bookstores had events. I
Yeah.
mean, woman books on the Upper West Side had events, and I can't remember the name of the one in the Village. There was one in the Village. Anyway, there were, go ahead.
I was gonna say,
Jennifer.
was it Three Lives? That used to be woman-owned.
It was before
Well,
Three
no, it was
Lives.
earlier than that. It was earlier than that. It was
Okay.
next door to the Duchess, the lesbian bar, and it was tiny, and it had like 4 books. And but you know, you saw on the flash of the
and then the gay bookstore popped up, Oscar Wilde books, right near
exactly down the street. But you saw in the video pop up the New Woman Survival Source Book, and that's really a catalog. Those are all being, you know, that is being sort of, there's some way you can get it now online, but it's an actual catalog of women's culture across the country, and it's unbelievable. Barbara, where were you sort of were you in Boston in the sort of 70s?
Yes, I lived in Boston through most of the 1970s, but my twin sister, Beverly Smith, who is one of the 3 co-authors of the Combahee River Collective Statement, also in our collection, in our anthology. Or should I say you're and Alix's anthology.
Our.
But she actually lived in New York City at that time and worked at Ms. So I loved hearing what Jennifer said about being, you know, like getting to work there too. But Beverly was there, of course, in the very early days when the magazine had just started. And that's how I got to meet some of the people who,
That's interesting.
you know, who Jennifer just described.
Well, it's interesting, you know, part of, I think that what gets lost in the translation into history is the sense of community, is that one woman, you know, there was no internet, and there was a telephone, and there were mimeograph machines. And so it would be, you'd meet someone at a party, you'd meet someone at a reading, you'd run into someone at a bookstore. I mean, I remember going to hear Judy Grahn read at Westbeth, and it was word of mouth that got me there. And, you know, demonstrations too, you know. Jennifer, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think there is reading in this book, reading on being trashed or on trashing, which is such an incredible piece. And I think makes me think a lot about things that go on nowadays. But when I really think about feminism, and I can be very critical and bitchy myself sometimes, it really has been this community that I entered into where I felt like I could ask for things, ask for favors, ask for somebody to give me their time. And almost always people said yes. And then I tried to return that. And, you know, to this day, lots of people will, you know, email me and ask me if they can pick my brain about something or whatever. And I almost always say yes, because I remember when that was offered to me, and it was sort of like feminism gave me this, there were all these barriers to access. You know, when you moved to New York, I was like, oh, I don't know anyone. My parents aren't famous. We're not from here. How am I going to get in? And feminism was just sort of like, come in. You say you're a feminist, I'm interested in you. So, you know, it's not always that Pollyanna, but it does have that element of it, of this affirmative, say yes to things that I think is really important.
I want to kind of transition.
And I just,
yeah, go ahead.
There were also, you know, creative and useful, but real frictions. You know?
Yes, absolutely.
You know, lesbian women were contending with straight feminists for, you know, a real centrality in the movement. And they were also contending with gay men, Black women and white women were, we could collaborate, but we were crossing, we were clashing too. And then, came Latina women and Asian women, and periodically there'd be almost little competitive third world. Will we all have a place here? It was, it was fraught. There was also a certain political righteousness on occasion, but we kept coming back to this larger thing and trading insights and even if we had to go away and sulk, learning.
Well, and yeah, learning. And Barbara, I want you to read that. You have a section from your own piece, one of your own pieces, if I can't come by, is one of your pieces in the book that you wanted to read, which speaks to this issue of community and difference.
Yeah, and conflict.
And conflict.
Collaboration and conflict.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that, Margo, that you raised that, because I was on the verge of doing the very same thing, because I think those of us who were involved in the early days and were committed, which was more than a notion, because it was not popular, particularly if we were women of color, to identify as feminists. We do have some fond memories of that time of blossoming and also that time of struggle. Yeah. But I was thinking, as we were talking about our memories and our experiences, I said, we've got to make sure that people understand that it was not all just a lovely walk in the park, that there were definitely conflicts, and they were based on real serious political issues and differences. I'm going to read to you a couple of lines from an article that I actually wrote. It was originally a speech titled Racism and Women's Studies. And it was a talk that I gave at the conclusion of the first National Women's Studies Association conference. I think that they expected me, because by that time I had been teaching Black women's literature and Black women's studies. And it was 1979, as I said. I started doing that in the early 1970s. And I think they expected me to talk about Black women's studies and Black women. But I decided I was going to talk about racism and women's studies, because that was what was on my mind and that was what was bothering me. And in that article, originally, as I said, a speech, I have a definition of feminism, and that's what I'm going to read. The reason racism is a feminist issue is easily explained by the inherent definition of feminism. Feminism is a political theory and practice that struggles to free all women. Women of color, working class women, poor women, disabled women, Jewish women, lesbians, old women, as well as white, economically privileged, heterosexual women. Anything less than this vision of total freedom is not feminism, but merely female self-aggrandizement. So, mic drop there.
Well, I love that. I love that definition. And what I was going to say, because it speaks to what I was thinking about after Margo spoke, if it had been a walk in the park, what would have been the point? And we would not have been engaged. I mean, we were trying to change the world. So even though various challenges were very painful, we had this idea that is so wonderfully expressed in those sentences you read of what feminism was, that it included all women, and
what it should be and could be, even when it wasn't.
Exactly. And that's that definition of feminism has sort of been lost. It's not something, let's just say it's not something the media popularized.
The media doesn't popularize it, but I do think it's somewhat popularly known among people who self-identify as feminists and study feminism. Even the book that Amy Richardson and I wrote 20 years ago, we quote Barbara as the sort of primary definition of feminism, that exact quote that you just read. And, I think and I think, and another quote of yours too, where I think you talk about how feminism isn't just sort of anything, it's really about ending the lived oppression of women. It's acknowledging that that occurs. So it isn't just sort of like, hey, everybody has it tough. You know, it has this specific lens that you don't want to lose, that I think is sort of an interesting way to think about now, because in the last 20, 30 years, the idea of gender being on a spectrum, and what we mean when we say woman, what we mean when we say gender is altered so much in my lifetime. And I wonder how that affects the way you, Margo, and Barbara think about feminism and that particular definition you just gave us, Barbara.
Well, if I can respond directly to that, I have a Post-it note in the book right about the paragraph that I just read. And I wanted to explain, and I didn't want to forget to say this. If I was writing it today, at the very least, I would include trans women and Muslim women.
Mhm.
So, you know, the state of the art, it is what it is at the time.
That's right.
But because of where we are coming from politically and the kinds of, you know, like principles that we have, and the fact that we're always trying to expand, and that there are a few generations following us who are teaching us things, we can always look at things more inclusively. And that's, you know, we have an even bigger movement and sisterhood than we did back in the day, because, like, as you said, we understand that gender is along a continuum. We have people who identify as gender non-conforming, non-binary, and we're cool with it. We're really good with that. So it's exciting to me. I find it exciting.
Well,
It's also so interesting to be in that position that women, the older generations were when we sprang out in the 70s. Oh, okay, there's more for me to think about. Oh, wait a minute, I'm nervous about this. You know,
Yes.
let me study, let me take it in, let me talk to people about it. So there's a kind of, there's eagerness and some gratitude that it keeps changing. There's a certain humility you have to
yes.
find inside yourself too, and that's not always easy.
No, it's not always easy, but you know, I mean, one of the things about feminism as a way of thinking that I was reminded of working on the book is that it's actually about that expanding. I don't like the word tent because tents have boundaries on them, but it's the idea of, you know, that the nature of what a human being is, that it continues to expand. And I think that feminism and our movement, it had something to do with that. I mean, there was a sense of opening up and being forced to, you know, look at someone different from you and say, oh, is that how you're, I mean, I recently had an experience. I did an event with a very distinguished woman, writer, and we had gone to the same college, and she had come from poverty in Brooklyn. And she said in her memoir, and she mentioned again in this talk, that she had to borrow a typewriter when she was at Radcliffe. She did not have a typewriter. And I was just like, it was my privilege. That had never occurred to me, you know. I mean, so it's a continue, and I thought, oh, that's privilege, and that's, you know, that woman's life and my woman's life, and you know, then we have a conversation. But it's this ever expanding, you know, set of ideas. I was interested. One of the questions that comes up later, but it occurred to me too, is the murder of this woman in London by the policeman, and the huge demonstrations there. And Barbara, you started writing the Combahee, came together as the Combahee Collective, organizing about the rape murders of, was it 12 Black women in Boston? And
yeah.
And the question asks, you know, sort of, this is kind of leaching over into the next part of the conversation, but the question was asked, what do we do now? What advice do we have to offer from, where we are for that new movement of women to end violence against women? I mean, that's obviously, comes up in the book, and it was part of what we were doing.
And it's jumping out in, what's going to be more accumulation of understanding and analysis around the murders of Asian women.
Yes.
This obtuseness and refusal to accept double jeopardy, okay?
Right.
They're women. Triple oppression, misogyny, patriarchy, white supremacy,
Right.
Get it in the head. Work with it. I don't mean us. But
Well, I mean,
the commentary is pretty obtuse. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
yeah.
And that's what I wanted to say about, you didn't quite ask it in this way, but I think that implied is if you are organizing, if we were organizing against violence against women in the 1970s, why is violence against women, like these murders, the one in London, the one in the multiple ones in the Atlanta area just this week, why do these kinds of atrocious actions continue to happen, these atrocious crimes, these hate crimes? And the answer is because patriarchy still exists.
Right.
We have not been able to smash patriarchy. We also haven't been able to smash racial capitalism. We live through the stages of these systems of oppression. We live through them. If you look at different decades, different centuries, different, periods, etc., different geographic locations, you see how people of principle and people who are committed to struggle and to justice, you see how we deal with those realities as time goes on. And one of the things I guess I want to throw out there, not that anybody necessarily, I hope nobody's thinking this, sometimes I think that later generations, they think because the issues are similar from generation to generation, that we're not accomplishing anything. And that's not true. There was no understanding that there was such a thing as sexual assault or domestic violence during the early years of the feminist movement. There was no consciousness that that was a reality. We have forced the establishment to at least look at these categories of egregious behavior as criminal and as ones that need to be prosecuted in a very, very, very problematic criminal injustice system. Not all of us think that that's the best route for solving all of that. But as I said, it's because we have not managed to eradicate the systems that we see manifestations of the poison of these systems. It doesn't mean that we're not accomplishing anything.
Well, that is true. I mean, it's unbelievable that those categories didn't exist then. Jennifer, you as I'm going to call on you as the younger generation, because we have talked a little bit about the present moment, but you had a couple of sentences from that great Flo Kennedy that you were going to read, just so we have her voice. Her voice is,
awesome.
you have her, but we have her in the book too. Just
Yes,
so you know.
exactly. I just wanted people to see her if they weren't familiar, because she was extremely chic and had a lot of command and authority of her physicality as well as just her brain. So she was good at these sort of Zen cone aphorism, short, sweet, funny things. So under employment, there are very few jobs that actually require a penis or vagina. All other jobs should be open to everybody. And then the innocence of good people is inexcusable. Naivete is a luxury only the pigocrats can afford. And the reason that one really stuck with me right now is I think that in the last year, white people and concepts around innocence, I'm not racist, I'm innocent of that. And having that be the most important thing is to have someone tell you, or for you to tell yourself that you're not part of it, has seemed to thaw slightly into the idea that maybe there's something worse than innocence, and actually or something better than innocence, and it would be wisdom, knowledge.
Yes.
And that there's a way in which that innocence is actually just ignorance and blinders.
Well, it's interesting. That brings us, the idea of innocence brings us to the notion of what are we innocent of now? I mean, what remains to be done aside from, I mean, it all comes under the umbrella of smashing patriarchy. I mean, aside from smashing patriarchy, what do we have to, what are the issues we still have to work on? And, you know, I think that, I mean, a friend of mine just said, do you think your life would be different if you were a man? And we had that conversation, but maybe talking about what some of the, what in the category of work that remains to be done, what would you put there?
I think it all remains to be done. I think we're rhetorically further than we are in terms of the lived experience.
Oh, okay.
So almost all those issues, they've moved, they've changed, they've transformed, they've been named, they've been theorized. So all of that is incredibly important, but I don't see tons of resolution around any issue really yet. But there's been progress. And I was thinking, you know, the National Women's Studies Association over the last 50 years has changed a lot. And that is sort of, you know, the people that engage with feminism in terms of theory and a lot of the stuff that's in this book, it's those people. It's people who study, even though I don't think you need to have read these things to be a feminist, but scholars are going to, and interested students. And 2 years ago, the whole conference was about Combahee. And I think that is what's happening right now in the academy. And I think it's also leaching out, and I mean the academy really broadly, I think it's leaching out to our understanding of what feminism is. And I do think that is a broader, or maybe more pointed or more revolutionary feminism than the feminism I initially understood when I was coming of age. Mm-hmm. So that to me is maybe something that's going on right now.
Barbara, you mentioned a book the other day, Unapologetic.
Yes.
It has a great subtitle.
It's a queer feminist, I think it's a queer Black feminist manifesto. I'm sorry I don't have it in front of me so I can say it correctly. It is by Charlene Carruthers. And what's interesting about it is, if I may mention another press, it's published by Beacon Press. And that's one of our friendly, well-loved presses, I think. But in any event, Charlene has been a leader in the Black Lives Matter movement. And what's interesting about the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter overall, is that a lot of the leadership are people who would identify as women, as femmes, as feminists, as transgender women and sisters. So what you have then with, you know, this incredibly dynamic and significant movement is that you have people who are using Black feminism and feminist principles, organizing around issues that are not primarily gender based. And that's a real breakthrough. Just think about it historically. So you have people who absolutely embrace the politics of Black feminism and of feminism writ large, but what they're working on is police brutality. And I think where we need to go as we continue and in the future, we have to understand police brutality is a feminist issue. The workers who are organizing to try to get a union at the Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama, led with by a lot of Black women, that's a feminist issue. Dealing with the pandemic and the racial and class disparities around how the disease and how COVID-19 is affecting different communities. Those are feminist issues. All of these are feminist issues, and that's where the concept of intersectionality comes in. And that's really, I think, what we're working for. There's a word I want to throw out before, it's too late to do so. And that word is solidarity. Solidarity is when you understand that an entry to one is an entry to all, and that we all have this responsibility and accountability to make sure that everything on the planet, not just, humans, but all life on the planet, that includes plants and other living beings, that all are matters for our concern. All doesn't mean we can work on every single issue because there's only 24 hours each day, but we can be aware of how what we're doing in our little corner connects to all the rest of that.
Well, it's interesting. I think it speaks that patriarchy would just as soon all these things remain separate, and then we don't have, and solidarity gives us power. There's one question from Chantel in Canada, who's a federal public servant in Canada, and she's talking about, I try to push the dial whenever possible, but as a public servant, I'm expected to remain impartial and non-political. I think that's, for Chantal, it's much clearer than it is for many of us, but it's the issue of how do you become an activist? When do you take the risk to be active, like the Amazon, workers? I mean, that's a big issue. So she asks what our advice is, what the trade-off is there. And
well, one thing, the word feminism as a label has altered in the last 10 years, and it's used a lot more widely. But I think sometimes when you're expected to be objective in your job or neutral or not political, one thing is to just avoid some of those words that can be magnets. You say, I'm a feminist, and immediately they're screaming at you about Hillary Clinton. Or you can say, I think it's important that we have, equal healthcare and, equal, at this job that we cover birth control pills as well as Viagra. Right. That you talk about these specifics if you're in a situation where it's not safe to use some of this language.
And you start finding out who you can talk to among your colleagues, and start comparing information on what the visible, as health insurance, birth control coverage, etc., but also what the non-spoken, taken for granted. Does, as in journalism, it was really in the 60s and 70s with the pressures of, the pressures of the left, of civil rights, Black power, and women's movement, then queer rights. What is objectivity? That really started being consistently challenged and started to shift.
Yeah.
So what's a given that needs not to be a given?
I'm trying to see if we have some other, someone from, could you speak some more to the still unfulfilled and still can part of your title? That's an interesting question, because it became clear to Alix and me as we were working, when Hillary Clinton was defeated and we realized we weren't going to have the book party in the White House. It was like the energy changed in our meetings, and we were depressed for about 32 seconds. And then it was like, but, then came the Women's March. And then it was like everything was up for grabs again. We had a new feminist movement. And then came Me Too. And it was like, started to get huger. And then came Black Lives Matter. So it was this gigantic, suddenly, activism happening as it had not happened since we were young. So we came to think, well, this is not a back burner volume. This is like a living volume, because we started to see the same issues come up. So I'm curious if people want to refer to specific pieces in the book that still have use. I mean, Jennifer, you talked about Combahee being, what was it, a whole conference devoted to the National Women's
Well,
Studies
yeah, I mean,
Conference.
I think within feminism in colleges and even in high school feminism, as it's being taught, I think Combahee is this is long overdue, but I think it's considered probably one of the most important documents. And when a lot of people will say intersectional feminism and maybe not totally have a grip on what it means, but will know that they should read that, and they should maybe read the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, and they can begin to understand it and understand what they're talking about. They know it's important to be an intersectional feminist, and then it's sort of people are starting, I think, to put together the pieces of what would give that meaning.
And it's also it's interesting in the book. You see with Fran Beal's piece, which is very early, Double Jeopardy, you see
Yeah,
the
right,
evolution of intersectionality.
Exactly.
I mean, in a way, it wasn't much evolution. I mean, it was sort of there at the birth. It got developed through Combahee and later on, in terms of talking about it, on different levels.
We
But
now also realize that, on the legal front, for example, that's what Pauli Murray was.
yes, exactly.
Absolutely doing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah, Jane Crow. That was on purpose. She was Black and she was a woman.
And the theories, that subsequent legal scholars took hold of. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
including Ruth
Bader Ginsburg.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, they actually were. I don't know if they were actually contemporaries as far as age. I think that Pauli Murray would have been older than she, but the thing is, they were definitely in each other's, worlds. And my understanding is that Pauli Murray had a huge amount of influence on Ruth Bader Ginsburg as far as how to formulate the legal
there
argument.
Were papers that she wrote that Ruth Bader Ginsburg
drew on.
Right, indeed.
So
Indeed.
what I would say, part of what I would say about the "and still can" would be develop these ideas. Those of you who are in the streets now and thinking now, those of you, we had a question from Singapore, Amy Sim from Singapore. What are the speakers' views of gender fluidity, sexual diversities? It's ripe to be written about and thought about, right? I mean, it's.
Yes.
Yeah, and it is being written about and thought about.
Right. And it's being analyzed, it's being dramatized, and it's being, turned into all kinds of forms.
I would say not only to think about these ideas, but to act upon them. Make this real. This is like a handbook, it can be like an organizing manual. Take the lessons from the words and see how those words and ideas apply to the issues that you're concerned about, like environmental,
Right.
degradation and destruction. How do these ideas apply? That certainly, as we were talking earlier about how people in the movement for Black lives, I think, have utilized Black feminist perspectives and ideas and values. I just wanted to mention something that I did not know about, which is an article by Mary Ann Weathers. It also came out in 1969, and the title is, and this is, of course, from the book, the title is An Argument for Black Women's Liberation as a Revolutionary Force. And it was in Cell 16's publication. Cell 16 was a Boston feminist organization, and it's international. That is the article. Mary Ann Weathers' article is international. It's talking about the war in Vietnam and liberation movements and working women and poor women in class. It's just really a phenomenal article, and it is that same year as Fran Beal. I actually know about Fran Beal's work, but I did not know about this particular piece. Hats off to you and Alix, honor.
Well, I remember telling you about it. It was in No More Fun and Games, and
Right.
No more.
no more fun and games. Just in
Yeah,
closing,
right.
No More Fun and Games was so radical that I felt, even though I lived alone, I had to read it under the covers with a flashlight.
The life
So
of the psyche. Yes.
Yeah.
yes.
Anyway, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I think we have to leave it there. And I think hats off to Alix and Honor is not a bad place to leave it. But thank you really to all the panelists for really exciting discussion. And I don't know if you've been able to see the comments from the viewers, but you've really reached a lot of people today, and they're very grateful to you. You have been listening to Jennifer Baumgardner, Margo Jefferson, Honor Moore, Alix Kate Schulman, and Barbara Smith discuss women's liberation, feminist writings that inspired a movement and still can, a new collection from Library of America, edited by Alix and Honor. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Tuesday, March 30, it's The Great American Western on Page and Screen. Join film critics Terrence Rafferty, Jean Seymour, Imogen Sarah Smith, and LOA Editor-in-Chief Emeritus Jeffrey O'Brien as they recommend and discuss their favorite Western books and films and why the genre has such an enduring hold on the American imagination. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about the Women's Liberation Volume and Library of America's Western Novels and Stories collections, and links to purchase those and other volumes of great American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Alix Kate Schulman, Honor Moore, and all our panelists, and to Casey Blake and Columbia Center for American Studies, and Valerie Paley and the Center for Women's History at the New York Historical Society. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful evening.